Hello, everybody. All right, welcome everyone to Luther College, and thank you for joining us here tonight. My name is Lita Presteman, and I am a sophomore biology and Spanish major here at Luther. Before welcoming Mr. Shawn Otto and Dr. Michael Osterholm to the stage, we'll open with a land acknowledgement. The land on which Luther stands has been home to the Iowa, Sac, Fox, and Dakota people and their ancestors. As part of the neutral ground created by the U.S. government to control the movement, lives, and livelihood of Native peoples, this land was home to the Ho-Chunk during their forced displacement from Wisconsin. The dispossession of the Iowa, Sac, Fox, and Dakota, and the forced migration of the Ho-Chunk people was motivated by the interests of settlers such as those who founded this town and this college. The Ho-Chunk, during their residence here, addressed the land as grandmother. The tribe's orator, Wakan Dakora, believes his people were extended the blessing of this place by the Great Spirit, saying, "We did not make it, nor could we make it so pretty and fair a land." Please honor this history and the ongoing connection of the descendants of these early residents to this place. Please also honor and care for the land, water, and resources such as these residents have, like a loved and loving elder to whom we owe our life. In a moment, Dr. Osterholm will come to this out and say a few words about the David J. Roslien Distinguished Lecture on Science and Leadership and to introduce Shawn Otto. To welcome them, I want to say how incredibly excited I am to be here and how amazing opportunities like this are for Luther students, staff, faculty, and the larger community. A week from today is U.S. Election Day, and as a biology major and a first-time voter, I am especially keen to hear what Mr. Otto has to say tonight about science, policy, and public perceptions. Mr. Otto has done a lot of work in this area, such as writing his book, The War on Science, Who's Waging It, Why It Matters, What We Can Do About It, and co-founding and producing the U.S. presidential science debates. We have seen science be politicized in several key issues, such as the pandemic and climate change. We have seen how destructive and divisive it can be when government leaders dismiss or distort science, but we have also seen how science can be a unifying social force. I think this lecture is very important as we look to the election next week and the new directions the results will entail. So please help me in giving a warm Luther College and Decorah, Iowa welcome to Mr. Shawn Otto and Dr. Michael Osterholm.
Thank you. Thank you, Lita, for that very, very kind introduction. Good evening, and welcome to the 6th Dr. David J. Roslien Distinguished Lecture on Science and Leadership. I'm Mike Ostrom, a 1975 graduate of Luther College and a former advisee of Dr. Doc Roslien. And I now serve as a Regents Professor here at Luther College and as well as a Regents Professor at the University of Minnesota. I am very honored tonight to be able to bring to you the sense of what you're about to hear and saying that you will hear from someone who I have ascribed to many as one of the smartest people I know on the face of the earth. But let me give background. The David J. Roslien Distinguished Lecture on Science and Leadership honors Doc for his 36 years of distinguished service to Luther in his numerous roles as assistant, associate, and full professor of biology, Dean of Admissions and Financial Aid, Vice President of College Advancement, Executive Vice President of the college, and finally as Interim President. Doc devoted his entire career to his students and to Luther College. We are here to pay tribute to you, Doc, by bringing nationally leading scientists, policymakers, and other experts to Luther to expose our students and faculty, as well as the community, to the great science and policy issues and challenges our world faces today. This lecture could not be more timely. Doc, while this special lectureship honors your legacy, the many hundreds of Luther students whose lives have been indelibly shaped by your teaching, advising, enduring friendship, and by your example of true servant leadership is a living legacy that will thrive forever. Doc, enjoy and your daughter Jennifer and son John. Can you please stand? There they are. Thank you. I know that was hard. Thank you. Yes, we realize success in life often comes from the support of family. Joy, Jennifer, and John, we honor you tonight too. Thank you. Previous Roslien lecturers include internationally renowned journalist Ted Koppel, pioneer climate scientist James Hansen, Minneapolis Federal Reserve Bank President Neil Kashkari, and former CDC Director Dr. Rochelle Lewinsky. And in 2017, you got stuck with me as the first of the lecturers to talk about the lack of preparedness for a future pandemic. Wow. Before I introduce our special Roslien lecturer, I want to acknowledge the many individuals here at Luther who have helped make this evening possible. First of all, the Office of the President, including current President Jennifer Ward and soon to be newly installed President Brad Chamberlain. Could both of you please stand? I also want to thank the faculty and staff in Luther College's Center for Ethics and Public Engagement, and particularly Andy Hageman, who has been the conductor of this event, and supported by Asher Smith, Avery Rage, and Elizabeth Loma. Again, thank you. Shawn Otto is an internationally renowned science communicator who speaks to audiences worldwide about the scientific foundations of democracy and the causes and dangers of anti-science authoritarianism. He is the author of the award-winning nonfiction book, The War on Science, which predicted the rise of anti-science authoritarians and the threat that that poses to democracy. This book is the definitive work on science and its relationship to democracy and on why science has come under political attacks in recent decades, most notably in recent months. This book has been called a game changer and probably the most important book you'll ever read. He has advised candidate scientific debate efforts in many different countries. He's also an award-winning screenwriter and novelist, including writing and co-producing the Academy Award-nominated movie House of Sand and Fog and the LA Times Book Prize finalist for his literary crime novel, Sins of Our Fathers. Otto was awarded the IEEE USA National Distinguished Public Service Award for his work, elevating science in America's public dialogue. The IEEE is the world's largest technical professional organization. It is dedicated to advancing technology for the benefits of humanity, why he was so eligible for that award. He is the co-founder and producer of the U.S. Presidential Science Debates at sciencedebate.org and the only person to get Donald Trump to answer science questions during the 2016 presidential campaign. Today we are very honored to have Shawn address this Roslien lecture just days before what will have been described if not the most consequential presidential election in our country's history. After Shawn's lecture, I will again join him on the stage for a discussion and moderate a question and answer session with you. There are 2 microphones in the front of the room here for which you can come to the mic to ask your questions. Ladies and gentlemen, Shawn Otto will address the war on science, who is waging it, why it matters, and how it can keep from dividing us. It is my true honor to share this podium tonight, and in particular to be on the same stage with one of my personal heroes, Shawn Otto.
Thank you, Mike. Can you hear me? Can everybody hear me all right? Yes, you can? Okay, good. Just going to turn my little clicker on here. This is about the war on science, hopefully not the war on technology. Okay, so I think we're set. Yes. So I wanted to start out tonight with a little experiment. I thought it would be funner than some of the ways that I sometimes start out this talk. I want to just kind of poll the audience here, see how well you perceive reality. So let's see, by show of hands, how many people think that humans are causing climate change? Okay, most of you, few brave souls not raising their hands in this crowd. How about, is GMO food, genetically modified food, safe to eat? Okay, educated group. In fact, scientists at the national academies polled on this question, and there are far more scientists who say that GMO food is safe to eat than say that humans are causing climate change. How about this one? Show of hands, does the Earth orbit the sun? Yes? Okay, not too many flat earthers and geocentric folks in the audience. Okay. Now let's get, a little further. Gotta get closer. Okay, so what about, okay, yes, we gotta start over because I got too far. See, it is a war on tech. Okay, here we go. Are square A and square B on this slide the same color? Okay, so how many people say that they are different colors? Or raise them higher. Let's commit here. Okay, and how many people think they're the same color? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 6. Okay. Now, what if I told you, now see you 6 just read fast, right, because you saw this slide. What if I told you that the evidence supports the conclusion that A and B are the same color? I mean, this is the same kind of thing that you hear from climate scientists, right? The evidence supports the conclusion that humans are causing climate change. Would you go along with that then? No? Well, if I can really prove it to you, oh, there we go. What would you say now? So the problem is that the human brain, the visual cortex in the human brain, has about only 10% of its inputs from our eyes. The other 90% come from other parts of the brain. We actually do, as postmodernists have argued, somewhat to my chagrin, construct our reality from a lot of pre-held assumptions. Some of them are hardwired in. And the problem with this, the challenge with this, is that we're not necessarily consciously aware of them. For instance, our brains evolved with gravity. The light normally comes from above us. If we're in a shadow situation, we will adjust. Our eyes and our brains automatically adjust without our conscious awareness of that to make us assume that what we're seeing are different colors in this picture when in fact they're the same. So I want you to think about that, because what it does is it illustrates how we can misconstrue reality, and if we can, how that can be used to manipulate us. What science does, and what it's been famous for and infamous for, is it's a great tool for us to see past that, to see past all the ways we confuse ourselves with our faulty perceptual mechanisms and with all the other assumptions and inputs that we make into the conclusions that we see every day about the world around us. It gives us a tool, but we have to listen to that tool. We have to listen to the evidence rather than what feels right or what seems right automatically. So wherever the people are well informed, Thomas Jefferson wrote, they can be trusted with their own government. And Thomas Jefferson was a scientist and a lawyer, like Francis Bacon, one of his heroes. And this phrase I open the book, The War on Science, with too, because it's really the key to self-governance. And it's the key to Jefferson's thinking about the relationship between science and democracy. When he was tasked with writing the Declaration of Independence, he holed up in that second floor rented room in downtown Philadelphia, and he was looking for a rationale for this independence, because he knew that if we couldn't keep the other countries of Europe out of the war, the rebels would surely lose. As Franklin said, we must all hang together or we shall surely all hang separately. And to make that argument to stay out of the war, he turned to the greatest hits in the courts across Europe of the time, which were the ideas of science. In fact, John Locke, Francis Bacon, and Isaac Newton were what he called his trinity of three greatest men. He had their portraits, they still hang actually in Monticello, and he looked to these men who were scientists for the ideas to support the notion that the United States should be a free and self-governing country. So Franklin was also on that committee, and the two of them came up with, essentially by boiling down the ideas of John Locke, Francis Bacon, and Isaac Newton, and others, David Hume notably, that if anyone can discover the truth of something for him or herself using reason and science, then no king, no pope, and no wealthy lord has any more right to govern than we the people. That right was intrinsically in everyone. Here's an early draft, his first draft of the Declaration, and I bring this up to just show how difficult, again, this was even for Jefferson. We all get caught in our assumptions, and it's hard not to. Here he wrote, we hold these truths, we hold these truths to be sacred and undeniable, that all men are created equal. And he showed that draft to Franklin, and Franklin is the one who made these quick backslashes here and instead changed it, drawing on the writing of his friend David Hume. But John Locke had also talked about this. We hold these truths to be self-evident. Franklin made the argument that if you say sacred and undeniable, then suddenly you're basing the argument for the United States on religion again. And the second you do that, anyone with a different faith is going to argue with it, and we're going to be caught right back in an authoritarian conflict. So we have to separate religion out of the equation, out of the rationale for democracy. There has to be a separation of church and state, so we'll go with the argument of self-evident. But what do we do now, 248 years later and some months, when we're faced with this explosion of technology around us, an explosion of knowledge from science? In Jefferson's day, you can go down to the Library of Congress and see a recreation of his library, this round room where every book that was known in the world at the time was in this easily accessible to him. He could contain all that knowledge in his head. He was a brilliant guy. That's not possible for anyone anymore. In fact, we have to rely on the writings of other scientists in other fields and the conclusions that they make, because nobody can read it all. Nobody can understand it all. We have a certain amount of trust now that we have to invest in the process. And the second that science, or in this case technology, become less and less accessible, a lot of you in this audience, I can tell, grew up where you could take the back off a TV set or a radio and pull out a tube, maybe even. Don't want to date you too badly, but there's no Phillips screws on the back of this iPhone, right? It's a lot less accessible to be able to take that apart and figure out how it works. It's become less a matter of know-how and more a matter of, say, Harry Potter's broom. Both of these things are functionally equivalent in our modern world, right? They're both just something that works. We don't necessarily know exactly how it works, but it works. They're both made by people cloistered away wearing long robes and uttering strange incantations. But the second that happens, science becomes a matter of belief, right? And that's where we become vulnerable to disinformation and misinformation, and, as Franklin noted, to endless arguments. So as an example on this, I often pick on the World Health Organization for this, because in 2011 I was reading through a report that got headlines around the world that your cell phone may cause brain cancer. I thought, that's kind of strange. And I read the report and I noticed that the statistical blip that they had found was actually technically below the noise level. It was an irresponsible headline. They could say may, yes, because anything's possible in science, But probable? No, highly unlikely, in fact, because I knew that cell phones use microwaves to communicate. And a microwave photon, if you look at it, it's way down here, way below the infrared radiation we all are emitting right now. We're all averaging probably about 100 watts of radiation coming out of each of our bodies at this moment as we sit here. Some of us maybe down in the 90s, up to others up to in the 120s. But that's far less energy than our skin. In fact, if you have to go all the way up through infrared, through visible light, through ultraviolet light, to the top or to the bottom end of ultraviolet before you get to a point where a photon has enough energy to knock an electron out of valence, maybe changing the way that a carbon atom chemically bonds, thereby maybe changing your DNA. But you have to be able to calculate that with confidence in order to know that. And you have to know a little bit about biology, a little bit about physics, and a little bit about chemistry to put all those things together. And who's going to do that? And first of all, and second of all, it's too complicated. How do you even communicate that? So we wind up with policy-making problems like this Board of Supervisors in San Francisco, all of them Democrats who voted 10-1 to require every cell phone shop in San Francisco to warn you that your cell phone may cause brain cancer. Even though there's absolutely no real evidence for it. When you look at the difference, it's like being hit by this BMW Z4 versus that P. I don't know if you can see that, but if they're both traveling at 30 miles an hour, which one do you think is going to do the most damage? So, but these things of scale, issues of scale, are difficult for us in general to perceive, and that's one area where we often get into trouble in science communication, in journalism, when they're reporting on science issues, and then in policy making that flows from that. So what happens if you trade that cell phone out for a voting machine? Well, you can see that that's another area that can be taken advantage of by actors who either are trying to hack the vote, very difficult in this case because they're not connected to the internet, or by people who want to cast doubt and suspicion, just like the conspiracy theorists that were arguing that your cell phone might cause brain cancer. I mean, these things are so inaccessible that even Superman can't figure it out, because the code is proprietary. So we wind up in situations like this. That's Matt Baker. He became famous after that tirade in Maricopa County, the county of Phoenix, which was very close. It went for Trump in 2016, but it went for Biden in 2020, and it went for Democrats in the midterms. But Trump was messaging quite a bit about voter irregularities and voter fraud. And with the inaccessibility of this, when science has become a matter of belief and tech has become a matter of belief, we run into problems again because we become vulnerable to that misinformation. Now, with those two small examples, just think about this next image. Anybody want to take a guess of what these lines represent, besides my wife or Mike? Well, sorry? Undersea cables is really close. They're chunked Facebook connections. And that's, by the way, the great firewall of China that you saw there. China blocks Western social media. But they may as well be, in general, internet connections between labs around the world. The pace of innovation is exploding because of the internet, because of our ability to work without regard to geography or without regard to time zone, to collaborate, to telecommute from anywhere. it's projected that we're going to create as much new knowledge in the next 20 to 30 years as we have in the last 400 years at this rate that we're moving right now. And with AI, that is probably going to be a vast understatement. But think about the political ramifications from Galileo moving forward, a lot of those new advances in science, and the way that they've disrupted our views of ourselves, our view of the world, our views of who we are as people. These are all, on either side of the globe here, unresolved science policy issues. Areas that we've really become stuck in Congress because we don't really have a built-in capacity in our slow democratic process to deal with the speed of innovation and change that we are facing and the social challenges that this is presenting to us. So the question is are the people still well enough informed to be trusted with their own government? Those two signs go very well together, I think. And this is having real world and really quite tragic consequences. The United States, through its use of evidence and science, became the world leader in science and technology, in the economy, in our political influence, and we were well positioned, as I'm sure Mike has told many in this audience, to be the world leader in our response to the pandemic, to have the best outcome of any country, because we were the most prepared, the most knowledgeable. So what the heck happened? In fact, we had, by most measures, the worst outcome of any country in the world. More than 1 million deaths. That's a terrible tragedy. And really, what happened began not in the date the pandemic struck, but back in 2017 or 2016. Budget cuts of a historic nature to science agencies 4 years in a row. Science agency leadership appointments left completely vacant. Scientific info and data removed from federal websites. For instance, the info on climate change was completely expunged from the White House website. Political activists were appointed to lead science agencies. These are things that were famously occurring in Stalinist Russia, the Trofim Lysenko affair, or in Maoist China during the Great Leap Forward, which led to the Great Famine, where authoritarian leaders were sidelining scientists and disregarding or punishing them. The result was that by the time the pandemic hit, more than 1,600 scientists had already left the employ of the federal government. But the problem isn't starting with Trump, and it won't end with him. The problem began quite a ways before. For instance, here's an article from 2012 about a new law in North Carolina outlawing sea level rise. Essentially what this meant was that planning departments, local planning departments, people who permitted road bed construction or new hotels near the ocean couldn't take scientific information into account. They could go to the legislature and use the official numbers, which was very similar to what happened in Maoist China. But it's not just on the right, it's also been happening on the left. Here, the Board of Snowmass, Colorado, voted to eliminate fluoride from the public water supply out of concern that it could cause intellectual impairment. Fluoride, I don't know if you know this, has been considered one of the 10 greatest public health advances of the last century for all the needless suffering and death that it has prevented. So this authoritarian / anti-science movement has been growing on both sides. How could that be? Well, science is really never partisan. In fact, you have to be both pretty progressive, creative, open to new things to be good with science, but you also have to be pretty conservative. You have to be careful that you don't stick your neck out too far or it's going to get chopped off by somebody in peer review, or if you, God forbid, you publish something and then it's shown to be wrong, you can be embarrassed, and that's a short way to an early career end. So science is never partisan, but it's always political. It's always political because it either confirms or challenges somebody's vested interests, and those people either support it or they fight it. So it's more effective to think about politics in terms of two angles, in terms of a plane instead of a line. We have the left, the progressive on the left, and we've got the conservative on the right. But there's also this top-down component between the authoritarian and the anti-authoritarian. And in that question, democracy and science are both firmly anti-authoritarian. They say, I'm not going to take what you say on faith just because you say it. Show me the evidence, and I'll judge for myself if what you say is true. That's the attitude that Jefferson and Franklin took to crafting the Declaration and to making many of their arguments in the early days of the Republic. But you can put any other leader anywhere else on this framework. For instance, Chairman Mao was definitely authoritarian, but he was on the left. Adolf Hitler was definitely and equally authoritarian, but he was on the right, where Vladimir Putin is very similarly too. The 8 best presidents for science, according to a large survey of scientists, all tend to be placed they're all in the top half, in either more to the left or more to the right, but firmly pro-democracy, anti-authoritarian. This is why the MAGA movement has become such an outlier, and why it's challenging not only on the science issue, but on the question of democracy and our capacity for self-government, because it's taking an authoritarian approach rather than a group decision-making approach that democracy is more famous for. So I want to talk about the 4 major battlefields in the war on science, and the first is the ideological battlefield. This is mostly about moral objections to origins science. This means the origin of the universe and the place of humans in it, or the origin and evolution of species, especially, again, humans. The origin of new humans. This just gets into issues of sex and sexual orientation, of birth control and abortion, HPV vaccination, and gender identity. All of those things around the origin of new human beings. The advancement of science into these areas that religious conservatives felt were God's territory has caused what James Dobson termed in 1989 a civil war of values. And the evangelical movement has been prosecuting that civil war since then, moving more and more and more into the political sphere. The target overall has been the Republican Party. That's where they've done their organizing in general. And there's some pretty good reasons for this that have to do with conservative outlook in general and affinity politics. So the result of that is, for instance, this recent discussion of a law in Ohio.
Weighing in on how public schools can teach things like evolution, the House today passed the Student Religious Liberties Act. Long story short, students cannot be penalized if their work is scientifically wrong, just as long as the reasoning is because of their religious beliefs. Instead, students are graded on substance and relevance. Every Republican in the House supported the bill. It now moves to the Republican-controlled Senate.
How are we going to compete in a global economy that is driven by science and tech if it's okay for the students to get scientifically wrong answers, just as long as they're religiously correct? So moving past that, we've also got a problem on the left. And it comes out of the postmodernist reaction to World War II. At the end of World War II, there was a lot of devastation, And postmodernist philosophers looked around at what modernism had wrought and the destruction of science and technology through the atomic bomb, but also through the use of science and technology by the Nazis, and wanted to cast doubt on the claims of moral superiority that modernism had. They did that by questioning the very idea of objective truth, claiming that this was just a grand narrative that white European men put out to justify their holding on to power, but that it had been morally and philosophically discredited, they claim. These were people like Lyotard or Lacan or Derrida or any of the other founders, some of them are not founders, but influential postmodernists listed in the bottom here. And the idea was there's no objective reality, we construct our reality. Now, that's somewhat true, as we now know from perceptual neuroscience, but it's not constructed in the same way. It's not constructed out of networks of words. Objectivity is not just a white male power claim. In fact, the whole scientific method that has objectively changed our world is designed to distinguish what we objectively know from what we believe, or as John Locke put it, from what we have but faith or opinion in his tests of what knowledge is. In other words, what we know is separate from our gender identity, our racial identity, our cultural or sexual or political or religious identities. Those things are all biases. They're not sources of knowledge when it comes to the physical world anyway. They're the things that we try very hard to expunge from our observations through the process of science, through the process of peer review, through the iterative honing and honing and honing of our ability to perceive and make statements about the world. But in the areas particularly of education and journalism school, this idea took hold and really became abused into the notion that journalists hold that there is no such thing as objectivity. But if you believe that as a journalist, how are you going to really dig to get to the truth? There it is in the new in the reporter guidelines for the Voice of San Diego. There's no such thing as objectivity. Linda Ellerby on the speaking circuit, we report news, not truth. There is no such thing as objectivity. Even Nick Gillespie, the editor-in-chief of Reason.com, an objectivist publication, is saying there is no such thing as objectivity. This idea has been so inculcated over the last 50 years in journalism that it's become very difficult for journalists to really parse out what their role is in reporting when candidates for office, for instance, are spouting complete falsehoods. Do you say, okay, I'm going to take this person here and we'll compare them, and we just have to be fair to each person, and then we let the readers decide? That's the generally accepted approach. The problem with that is that if we're in a world where advances in science and tech are dominating our policy discussions, that ceases to work. A journalist will say, there's always two sides to every story. Bob says 2 + 2 is 4, Julie says it's 6, the controversy rages, right? Why would Julie say that, and why are those stupid people backing her? You sell newspapers. The scientist will say, well, most times one side is objectively wrong. I can show you with these 4 apples that clearly Bob is right. 2 + 2 is 4. And then we've got politics. And the problem with this approach, then, with the Fourth Estate, our rudder in democracy, our means of steering ourselves, with them embracing and opening the door to the controversy of nonsense, is it opens our public policy making process to what's called false balance, where the arguments that are presented as equal are really not. And that opens the door in public dialogue towards extremes and authoritarianism by wrongly elevating unfounded arguments and placing them and presenting them as if they were equal somehow. The result of this had tragic consequences in the pandemic. When we aren't relying on facts, when we are allowing people megaphones to spread disinformation, we fall back on what we do, which is relying on our identity and our peer group to make decisions, because who can go through and figure out the physics, the calculus, and the biology of your cell phone? You rely on what you hear from the people around you. As a result, early on in the pandemic, you see, like right at the beginning, far more Democrats than Republicans died. That's because the pandemic hit America in our most populous Democratic cities like New York and LA. But then, as we started to get things under control and we started to get a vaccine, the Republican death rate started to go up until by this point over here, after the vaccine was really rolled out, 4 times the number of Republicans died than Democrats. So there are real costs to this approach of relying on our identity and our peer group when it comes to this kind of subject. And this is happening with all these policy issues, not just the pandemic. We see in this poll here exactly how it laid out. Look at who's at the opposite ends of the poll. I mean, it's us men especially in the audience. We have the biggest problem here. Something's going on particularly with men. And you've heard a lot more about that. I've been talking about this for years now, but you've heard a lot more about that recently with why young men especially are being attracted to Trump's messaging. The males have to have a discussion amongst ourselves and get our shit straightened out here. Then there's the industrial war on science. And this has really opened the door for a lot of the problems that we're seeing right now. The ideological war and the identity politics war, they laid kind of the philosophical and moral foundations, the arguments for having a war on science. But the industrial war really took it to industrial scale, if you will. It really has its foundation in the work of a guy named Edward Bernays, who wrote a book called Propaganda, which the Nazis actually picked up and used in their inculcation of their entire population with Nazi ideology. But after which point, Edward Bernays retitled the book Public Relations. But when he wrote Propaganda in 1928, it was after being in an effort to convince Americans to enter into World War I. Woodrow Wilson had appointed a committee called the Creel Commission, mostly of journalists and Edward Bernays, to spread propaganda to convince Americans to join World War I, join the war effort. And Edward Bernays perfected those methods later and applied them to business, developing this field of public relations. This picture here shows one of his first most successful public relations campaigns or propaganda campaigns. He was hired by the American Tobacco Company to convince women to smoke. They figured, well, back then smoking by women was considered, shall we just say, socially unacceptable because it was similar to fellatio. And he wanted to break that down. So how do you break that taboo? If he could, American Tobacco Company could see a doubling of their sales, perhaps. So what he did is he hid behind a suffragist figure that he knew and developed that, which became the third-party technique, hide behind someone else who has more authority in the world you're trying to target. And she, in turn, hired 5 young women, debutantes they called them, to walk down Fifth Avenue during the May Day parade in New York City, proudly smoking cigarettes. And they called them torches of freedom. No longer were they going to be chained by male ideas about what was proper for women. So thereby he co-opted the suffragist/feminist movement and women's health in one fell swoop and wound up successfully breaking the taboo against women smoking. This appeal to freedom has become the most powerful and often used appeal in public relations ever since. There is something called product defense, which product defense firms are actually created around, defining how and methods to defend products against litigation and regulation. And the idea is you've got a harmful product, you want to maximize revenue, so you engage in these techniques to reduce jury awards and delay regulation by arguing that there are uncertainties and alternative facts. This is the Global Climate Science Communications Action Plan funded by the American Petroleum Institute. And you'll notice the word uncertainties riddled throughout it. The idea was to poke holes in the certainties that James Hansen was talking about when he came here, but also when he testified before Congress in the 1980s, telling them that the evidence shows that this is real, that this is happening, and this is something that we have to do something about. And arguing then that if there is no such thing as certainty on this, then we should do nothing. And vilifying and intimidating scientists that disagreed with that position, creating an echo chamber surrounding lawmakers, particularly surrounding Republican lawmakers, because the conservative impulse in us is an impulse that says, let's wait, let's hold off. No, not yet. So that's why they targeted Republican lawmakers. And then, of course, you appeal to patriotism, freedom, and grievance. Here's an example of some of the techniques that they use. For instance, you'll hear people going on the lecture circuit in Rotary clubs or in, I heard somebody doing this exact talk at the Center for the American Experiment. I got invited to a lecture there. Oh, that we don't know why, but there's been no real global warming for 10 years, they'll say. And in fact, when you look at this, you'll see the land and ocean temperature anomalies. Well, that's true. From 2009-ish to 2020, 2021, temperatures actually went down. So how can we say there's global warming? It's called p-hacking, this technique. It's where you pick the endpoints. And as long as you can pick the endpoints, you can make it look like anything you want, when in fact, the overall trend has been going up. So this way of taking a narrow window on a big set of data is commonly used to make factual seeming arguments to convince people with fake science. This technique was used as part of a $2 billion campaign by the Koch brothers and Exxon to convince Congress to kill the cap and trade bill that was proposed in 2010. 2008, Obama, in his first State of the Union address, called on Congress to give him a climate bill that he could sign. And Congress was controlled by Democrats at the time, so it seemed like a foregone conclusion. So the Koch brothers, and you may have remembered hearing that name, Koch Industries, and Exxon really kicked it in and built up a giant infrastructure to try to kill that bill, creating and or refunding and or vastly expanding the funding to all kinds of front groups that were involved in this effort. And
I'm Tim Phillips, president of
Tim
Americans
Phillips
for
explains
Prosperity.
what they did.
We're here in Billings, Montana.
We certainly did TV ads, radio ads, social media. We did rallies, events. We launched something we called Hot Air.
And we're sending the message to Senator Baucus and Senator Tester to vote no on this job-killing, tax-increasing cap and trade.
We got a hot air balloon, put a banner on the side of it that said cap and trade means higher taxes, lost jobs, less freedom. And we went all over the country doing events and stirring up grassroots anger and frustration, concern.
Cap and trade will slow the economy and cost American jobs.
That effort wound up being very successful. But the offshoot that was even more dangerous for American democracy is that after they were successful, the folks that were working in that giant infrastructure started looking around and thinking, okay, well, what do we do now? We've got an incredible network built up of influencers surrounding Republican lawmakers. We successfully delivered our message to them through social media, through the general and the internet, through billboards, through targeted paid media, through slanted science journals, through fake science, through lawsuits. All these factors, what do we do now? Well, they started looking around at all the other industries that could benefit from their services, and this new field of product defense was born. Senator Sheldon Whitehouse talks a lot about this and has worked a lot on the whole science issue and the relationship between science and democracy and how it's been under attack. Some of the product defense firms are listed here. FTI Consulting, for instance, alone has 5,000 employees working in 28 countries, and their single goal is really to help companies defend their products against regulation in democracies. All these industries that I mentioned and several more have used product defense strategies and campaigns, and they do them through these various front groups. Americans for Prosperity alone has more employees than the National Republican Party. Republican influencers, as I said, are the ones that are targeted over and over because of the conservative impulse to say, let's hang on, let's wait. And that's an anti-regulatory impulse. And if you can get them to say no, then you can kill it. So that's why we wind up seeing more of this disinformation bubbling up in the Republican Party these days, because these poor people have been targeted over and over and over with disinformation networks from these product defense firms. The result is you wind up with a web of all this cross-confirming information, taking advantage of people's intrinsic scientific nature of looking at evidence and looking for little things that confirm that evidence. So we wind up seeing all these different sources of fake evidence that are actually engineered by these massive firms that surround these influencers and are successfully able to short-circuit the democratic process. And this has caused kind of a viral spread moment of disinformation in our political system. Finally, and I'm just going to be really brief here, the international war on science. Here's a photo of Margarita Simonian, who is the head of RT, which was recently banned from the US. It's the Kremlin's chief propaganda network, but it was presenting itself in the US for many years as a legitimate TV network. There she is again with this, there's no such thing as objectivity, this is just her version of it. This is why that notion has opened the door to propaganda. But we wind up then through our phones with a swarm of Russian, North Korean, Chinese, and Iranian sourced disinformation campaigns. The Russians are particularly invested in this. Mostly they're through social media. They all hide behind supposedly local people. And they spread public health misinfo, promote climate change, promote anti-vax, promote anti-GMO views. This is why these things are really gaining traction these days, because there's money put behind them. Things don't gain traction unless there's money behind them. They spread election disinformation because it's in their interests. Apply grievance and divisions, amplify grievances and divisions, promote sympathetic viewpoints, and spread political chaos. And why? Because it strengthens their position globally and economically. So we're facing a real crisis in communication. Now, this has happened before in human history. Whenever there's been a new communications technology, when you think about it, there's been a populist uprising, and there's been an authoritarian backlash. So this has happened, for instance, with, speaking of, here we are at Luther College, with the Reformation, and with the printing of the Bible and the distribution of the Bible, and the saying, don't take their word for it, read it for yourself. But then it happened again with the new technology of radio and film, which the Nazis quickly adopted to inculcate uniform political messaging throughout the German populace. It happened again with TV, which was stalled really by World War II, but once it got going, it really led to the populist reaction of the counterculture. And now we're seeing all of that put together on steroids through the social media / internet / AI communications revolution. The good news is that slowly we do develop the intellectual, psychological, and emotional tools to deal with this, to recognize it, to not take it as seriously, or to maybe understand the difference between the truth and fiction that we're seeing. But the stakes, as Jefferson and Franklin knew, were very important. We must all hang together, or we will surely hang separately. So how to win the war on science? I'm going to buzz through this because I want to leave a lot of room for Q&A, and I'm just a little bit over time. Legal action is number one of these 4 techniques. Mike Mann he's a great supporter of science debate, and he's a good example of this, suing some of these climate deniers for defaming him and actually winning jury awards, putting some back pressure on this investment. Then research. There's a lot of new research that's been going on into political polarization and political psychology, and it's yielding some very interesting and helpful information. Communication, the things like what I'm doing, but also what we can each do with our crazy uncle or whoever it is at the Thanksgiving table coming up. And I'm going to give you a couple of quick techniques for that. And then down the road, legislation. There is work going on this front, especially like, for instance, the Sheldon Whitehouse is working with the science defense team that he's set up. But there's a lot of conversation among certain members, at least in Congress, about what we can do here. And it's not necessarily just Democratic members, especially in the social media front. It's recognized bipartisanly as an issue. So to understand how we can, personally in our own lives, affect this change, we have to understand some of the psychology behind anti-science polarization. And the first thing is to know that, like that first slide I showed you, we tend to make incorrect assumptions sometimes about people who disagree with us. We think that we are smart, we don't hate our opponents, we vote in our own interest, we support policies that make sense, and we are thoughtful and rational. Meanwhile, they are stupid, crazy, or brainwashed. They hate us. They don't vote in their own interests. They support policies that won't help, and they're tricked by the media or deceived by some leader. In fact, both sides seriously overestimate how much the other side dislikes them by between 50 and 300%. So think about that and let it embolden you if you are trying to communicate your view with somebody who you think or suspect or know is counterfactual or anti-science. They're not going to hate you as long as you're respectful. In fact, sometimes they might even appreciate you talking to them. The reason that we tend to feel this way is because of evolution. It shapes our perceptions, especially about conflict and about politics. Vulnerability to predation shaped our emotions and our perceptions. In fact, vulnerability to predation has been shown to be really a big motivating factor behind implicit bias. And it's at work in our politics here too. Today, that vulnerability comes as perceived threats to our lives and our families, okay? But each side perceives themselves as prey and the other side as predator. So we become caught in this predator-prey, angry relationship. The dominant force in politics is that feeling of vulnerability, grievance over that feeling, and the desire to protect ourselves and our loved ones from harm. And that last point is key. That's the thing that we all share, no matter what side of that left-right or even the top-down political spectrum we have. You can reach anybody through appealing to that shared concern about avoiding harm. And so that's the kind of the key to communicating past anti-science polarization. Facts matter, but also the research shows that context matters. You don't just tell people that the iPhone works because it uses microwaves and they're safe. You have to explain to them why. It's the know-how piece that empowers people. So give them the know-how, especially the scientists in the audience. Don't just tell them the conclusion, Tell them the process of how you arrived at that conclusion, and trust that they're smart enough then that they will come to a similar conclusion themselves. That way they own it. It's not you giving it to them. That's much more powerful. And then back that up with a personal story. Personal stories give the emotional charge of why you care about this, and that they help bridge those divides. Allow people to express their concerns about harm and validate them, and frame your own positions in terms of our shared concern, as we've already talked about. The last bit I want to leave you with is something from couples therapy. Since America is like a couple who is going through a divorce proceeding right now, hoping to reconcile, but not sure how. So couples therapy actually provides us some really useful communications tools called active listening. Hold eye contact with that crazy uncle over Thanksgiving dinner. Listen with empathy, asking them about their position, not convincing them of yours, asking them about theirs. And listen as actively and engagingly as you can, and then say, is there more? And listen to them more also until they're done. Then faithfully repeat what they said back to them. You can summarize a little bit, but do it faithfully so that they know that you have actually heard them. That goes so far to diffusing emotional tension already. Acknowledge then that given their premise, their concern is reasonable. You're not agreeing with them, but you are saying that that you could see why they would feel the way that they do. Then say, only then say, can I share my perspective with you? And they may not want you to, and then you can't. But if they do, and by and large people will because of this fair trade psychology that we have, they'll say, sure, then speak about yourself. Frame your facts plus your story, again, in terms of avoiding harm, our shared concern about that, and then confirm that the message was received. Does that make sense? You don't have to convince them, but it does give you an opportunity to communicate, and it gives them an opportunity to hear it in a way that is diffused of emotion, or at least that emphasizes our shared connection, and that's where we have to get back to as a country. In 1920 in Weimar, Germany, right-wing relativity deniers were following, most of them engineers actually, I don't know why engineers seem to have a problem, Elon Musk and them, but they were following Einstein around. Elon Musk supported science debate. I don't know what happened to him. And they were calling his theory of relativity a big hoax and Jewish science. He wrote a friend at the time saying the world is a strange madhouse. Every coachman and every waiter is debating whether relativity theory is correct. Belief in this matter depends on political party affiliation. Does it sound familiar? The stakes are high, but I think with some of these tools and with care and remembering who we are, we can make it through them together. So thank you for listening.
Thank you, Shawn. We're now ready to take questions from the audience, if you'd like. Please just come to either microphone. While we're waiting on that, let me just ask you, I think, the question of the day. What is the greatest science communication challenge and war on science that we have as a result of the political division we're seeing in this country now? From your standpoint, what's our biggest risk?
Right now, I think, well, boy, it's hard to categorize it exactly that way, but the thing that I'm most concerned about is bespoke social media messaging, especially AI augmented, where people are given a message that is tailored to their particular emotional makeup and that is designed to have the most powerful impact on their individual psychology. That's an unbelievably powerful tool. It's not fully here yet, but people are definitely working on it. And that's very concerning. Once we aggregate things or disaggregate things down to the individual level like that, it becomes really hard to imagine how we have a shared consensus of reality.
You know, I think when we look back on the past 5 to 10 years, I think we really had a collision between what are facts and what is truth. You know, as a young boy raised here in Northeast Iowa, I learned that telling a lie was not truthful and was something you didn't do. But whether or not we agreed with facts was a very different thing. And today, I think we've conflated those two in a way that is really challenging today, as we see this last week of the political campaign, a tremendous number of ads and social media information being shipped out, which is at face value obviously not true, and it's difficult to even keep up by the hour as to how you defend yourself or how you lay out why that isn't true. What tools in this last part of your talk can we use right now, or can we, to try to deal with this explosion of untruthful information in a way that it doesn't seem to affect people's values? They don't find that truth is a critical issue in their lives.
Yeah, well, don't engage in social media. I mean, but it's pretty hard for many people not to. But when you go on Facebook or TikTok or anything, you are swamped with disinformation. I mean, it's pretty incredible. And the algorithms are just designed to feed you more and more and more and take you further down that rabbit hole. The more you react to it, the more you get. And it's addictive. What can we do right now, like in the next 7 days, I guess? Focus on and speaking out about, you know, we want leaders who are accountable to the truth. And unfortunately, you know, I'll just say it, Donald Trump has normalized lying. But he's not the first one. You know, as I pointed out, he's taken advantage of a fertile garden that's been laid by these disinformation campaigns that were targeting the Republican Party. And if you've got Republican friends or acquaintances, reach out to them and practice that active listening. You may not convince them, but you will bridge some of the divide, I think, and that doesn't have immediate benefits, but it does have long-term benefits.
Thank you. Uwe?
Uwe Rudolph, Professor Emeritus, and thank you for a wonderful presentation. I'm looking forward to reading the book.
Thank you.
Two things really disturbed me the most. You talked about lies and alternative facts. I don't understand why a company can make claims about a product that are not true and then get sued. Why is this not the case with politicians? And the second thing, the more evil thing, it's fine to talk to your relatives and friends, but when you've got someone like Elon Musk who has billions of dollars, or the Koch brothers, or how do we fight money in politics? I think that's the biggest concern I have.
Yeah, I think you're right. And actually, the Citizens United case is really what unleashed this entire product defense industry and the Koch brothers effort that I was pointing to. If that type of political intervention was not legal at the time, we wouldn't have had that problem. I think that that's probably the most important piece of legislation that we can pass, something to try to undo that Supreme Court decision. Whether we're going to achieve that this time is, you know, very much in question, I guess. But I think that there are plenty of reasonable Republicans in Congress who, given the opportunity, I think would vote for something like that.
Any other questions? I think we have one here, please.
Casper. I'm a staff member here. I've been in the book club that was actually reading your book before you came.
Oh, thank you.
And one of my questions, since the book is from 2016, is in the time frame from when you wrote it till now, one thing that has changed in your mind that you wrote about versus one thing that's maybe been reaffirmed from 2016 to now?
Yeah. Well, social media for sure. I mean, in 2016, it was around, but it wasn't as completely inundating our lives as it is now. And the level of sophistication of micro-targeting on social media was not available then. So that's been the biggest change and the biggest danger, I think. E pluribus unum is our motto for a reason. From many, one. From many, one. And with the approach of social media of completely individualizing advertising and ad service, I think that works against that. We really have to think through what these companies are and whether or not we're really outsourcing our public square to a private company who then gives megaphones to people who can pay for them to drown out everyone else, and whether that is a real way of, first of all, whether that is really constitutional. I think that there are some serious constitutional questions about that when it's framed correctly. But second of all, whether that is a way that we can continue to really even self-govern. So there are big issues there.
Let me just ask a question by framing it with a very brief story. During the pandemic, I had two very dear friends and colleagues, people who were very close to me for many years, who ended up debating with me for some period of time about COVID vaccines. And they continued to put up information off the internet versus what I shared with them. Now, I didn't profess to be the most knowledgeable person in the world, but I did know a little bit about COVID vaccines and what they could do. And these two people elected to follow what they took off from anonymous sources on the internet versus a friendship and some reason to think they may have some expertise. Both of those individuals eventually caught COVID and both of them died. And to me, it was such a tragedy because I couldn't see what I could do to connect with them in a way that said, well, can you give my point of view at least a run for it? Just try it. Mm-hmm. They didn't. So in a sense, they weren't receptive to an alternative message. I don't know if you can comment on that. How do we take that on when people are not receptive?
It's super hard. I've heard this story, I can't tell you how many times, wherever I've spoken, people have come up to me, talked about friends and family members. And you'd think that it'd be like It's a Wonderful Life or some other movie where, when we grow up watching these movies where the bad guy gets their comeuppance and they learn and they get wised up at the end, right? But that doesn't happen in real life. People hold on to their identity to the death. Even if it costs them their lives, they're not going to let that go.
Yeah.
So that's the power of this type of marketing, and that's what we're fighting. And the tools that I've suggested are just emerging. They're, I think, admittedly weak, but they're a way to counter it based on the research from what we know so far. And it's the only thing that research that I'm aware of has shown that really works so far, which is to try to establish that shared bond, and the universal is our shared concern about avoiding harm. And if that doesn't do it, yeah.
I'm afraid you're right.
Yeah.
One more question I know we have over here. Thank you.
So I really enjoyed your talk, and tonight, as well as in your book, you talked about the growing divide between the general public and the field of science and scientists. And as a recent grad who's going into the field of science, I'm wondering if you have any advice for how scientists can try to address that gap and make technology and scientific advances more realistic and more believable to the general public.
Mm-hmm. That's great. The first thing that I would suggest is any opportunity that you get to interact with policymakers or with the National Science Foundation. Talk to them, encourage them to change their grant requirements for public engagement. Still something like 2%. It's way too low, and I think that they need to fund it in order for there to be an ecosystem of communication there. Otherwise, it's often hard to support it. The next thing is if you know policymakers, be they Democrat or Republican, chances are they won't have a science advisor. Volunteer. Offer to do it. Say, I'll be your science advisor, I'll have a science advisory team. Congress in the late 1980s, no, 1991, may have my dates wrong here, but they got rid of the Office of Technology Assessment, which was Congress's science advisory body. And since then, they basically rely on lobbyists and the internet for their science information. So to the extent that you can be a volunteer science advisor, you could possibly influence policy for the better. Or you can influence the thinking of a policymaker. In your own communication, again, use some of those tools. Again, don't tell them so much, don't focus so much on what the conclusion is, focus on how we got to the conclusion so that the public understands the process. Mike, I've heard him, can't tell you how many times on TV and on the radio, and he's really good at breaking this down, at explaining the how of how we know these things. And I think that that's critical. And then tie it in again with an anecdote. Either it's an anecdote about why this is so important to you, or it's an anecdote like the one he just shared about two friends that wouldn't communicate with him. But some way to show the emotional impact of why this is important is really helpful too, to bridge that divide. So, story, context.
Question? Okay, we'll take one more, then.
Thank you.
Thank you.
That last statement about the process resonates with me. I'm a science educator of over 30 years, and I wonder if we're feeling a little bit of the consequences of No Child Left Behind when we saw time devoted to science and public education drop off. Science facts are important, but the process of how science comes to know something is just as important. I think about the pandemic and people saying they don't know what they're talking about. They're changing their mind when really they're adapting to the new reality.
For sure.
What role do you think public education plays in this war on science and how to combat it?
Oh, I think it's massive. And my wife, who's sitting right here, was a science teacher for many years, so I got a sideline view of this and what she faced in schools and in dealing with students and her colleagues. I think you're absolutely right, and the whole teach to the test thing is super challenging because there's no reward really for teachers to be spending time on exploring the process. But that exploring the process, when you can fit it in, and the hands-on education and the focus on critical thinking is really what ultimately is going to equip people to succeed, not only in science careers, but in life. And that's really why Jefferson was a backer of public education, to have an informed citizenry that thought critically about things. So thank you for your work, and I think that that's absolutely part of the challenge that we're facing, and No Child Left Behind did play a big role in that.
Well, Shawn, I want to thank you very, very much, not just for tonight's lecture, but for all the work that you're doing on this topic. And I will guarantee every person in this room, this particular presentation will come back to you in your life, time and time again, as we spend the next weeks, months, and years trying to reconcile this war on science. You'll remember you heard it here tonight. Thank you very much, Shawn.
Thank you. Thank you. Oh, yeah. I guess I'll be signing. Thank you.
Wow. Thank you. And Shawn will be outside in just a couple.